Hello, I'm Professor Richard Toye. I'm Director of the Centre for Imperial and Global History, and our seminar this afternoon is going to be delivered by Professor Amanda Nettelbeck of the University of Adelaide, and her title is Colonial Violence and the Limits of the Law. And Amanda, I believe this derives from a wider project which is on intimacy and violence.
That's right, yeah, thanks Richard, and thanks for having me back. The project is an ARC funded project led by Lyndall Ryan from the University of Newcastle, and there's 4 universities involved and 7 of us on the project, and it's around the ways that intimacy and violence are entwined in histories of colonialism in settler colonies of the Pacific Rim, since those things have tended to be regarded as, or analysed as 2 quite separate streams. That violence is often considered in terms of models of militarised violence, resistance from below, suppression from above, whereas intimacy, colonial intimacies, are regarded in terms of gendered relationships or labour relationships, and violence might enter into those domains, but they're not usually kind of considered in the same frame. So the nature of the project is to put those things together.
So what kinds of violence are we really talking about then?
Well, we're talking about, the project itself has a number of different threads, but my aspect of the project is on the way that violence, intimate violence, becomes understood and codified through mechanisms of law. So the way that legal institutions step in to either repress violence or to make it justifiable, and as part of the colonial project.
So can you give an example of what you'll be talking about this afternoon?
Yes, so today I'm talking about the Australian Frontier Wars, which is a really live issue at the moment in Australia. It's something which has been bubbling away in the public domain for the last generation, but has really got a new lease of life, particularly through work that Lyndall has been doing with her research team on Indigenous massacre, and which has had a lot of national airplay and international airplay in the last 12 months. But my project is not so much on that kind of large-scale frontier wars, which took place through, as we now know, through state policing campaigns and through settler retribution, punitive violence as kind of large-scale campaigns to terrorise Aboriginal people. So that sort of spectacular violence that was designed to terrorise them, intimidate them, and bring them in as a pacified labour force. I'm going to be talking today about more protracted forms of everyday intimate violence that took place on both sides of the frontier between people who knew each other well, often were embroiled in labour relationships and colonial economies together, and arguing that effectively we need to consider that kind of everyday protracted violence as part of the story of Australia's frontier wars.
And I guess from the point of view of the Aboriginal people themselves who are on the receiving end of this violence, how much can we really know of their experience, or are we totally dependent on colonial records from the other side?
We are largely dependent upon very fractured colonial archives, but there are many other ways. I mean, Indigenous people themselves have oral histories which keep the memory of this violence alive. There's other kinds of projects that are archaeological projects that are bringing this violence to the fore. Often settler communities and Indigenous communities will have overlapping accounts of that kind of violence, which is held in more private family accounts, and so that's another way of reading, across the grain of the archives. But in many ways, it's problematic to try and recuperate Indigenous voices that aren't there, and to try and historically reconstitute Indigenous people who largely don't have a voice in the colonial archive. But it's still possible, even with that fractured archive, to read the ways in which Indigenous people experienced and survived colonial violence.
Amanda Nettelbeck, thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard.